If you have ever experienced sleep paralysis, you know exactly how terrifying it can be. You wake up, your mind is conscious, but your body is completely frozen. You are trapped inside your own physical shell, unable to move a muscle. Today, we are going deep into 5 chilling accounts where the fragile line between a dream and a horrifying reality became completely blurred for those involved. Our first story begins with a young college student during finals week. They were incredibly stressed and sleep-deprived, staying up late to study for a biology exam. Around 3 in the morning, they finally fell asleep. What happened next felt like a hazy dream. They woke up in their bedroom, but everything felt heavy. When they tried to sit up, they realized they could not move. Their eyes were the only part of their body that responded, darting around the dark room. They looked to the side of the room, and when they looked back to the center, they froze. A woman was standing right there in a black dress, holding some sort of long, thin object. The student desperately wanted to call out for their mother, but their vocal cords were paralyzed. No sound came out. The woman walked closer, knelt beside the bed, and touched the student's forehead. The cold touch felt completely real. When she looked down, the student recognized the face. It was their mother. The student tried once more to scream, but they were entirely trapped inside their frozen body. The woman stood back up, walked calmly to the door, and disappeared into the house. When the paralysis wore off seconds later, the student leaped out of bed, screaming for their mother. They ran into the hallway, where a door opened. Hands reached out to hug them, but it was not their mother, it was their father. He held them close, crying, and told them that he missed her too. It turns out, the student's mother had passed away 3 weeks before this night. Our second account involves a 24-year-old who was experiencing a deep sleep. They were in the middle of a nightmare, dreaming of being pursued through a dense forest by a strange creature. As the dream faded, they slowly began to wake up. They were back in their own bed, but they quickly realized they could not move. Every single muscle in their body was locked, and then the quiet of the night was broken by an incredibly bizarre sound. It was an indescribable noise, sounding both robotic and alive at the same time, repeating rhythmically every 3 seconds. At first, the sound was soft, but with each repetition, it grew slightly louder, as if the source was slowly creeping closer. The noise grew so unbelievably loud inside their head that they wanted to scream, but they could do nothing. Their eyes darted around the room and locked onto the closet door. The closet door was open just a tiny crack, which was highly unusual because they never left that door open. Peering through the small crack was the distorted, pale face of a man. The man had an unhumanly large, open-mouthed smile, stretching from ear to ear. Every time the robotic noise sounded, the closet door and the smiling face seemed to creep closer to the bed. Just as the terror reached an absolute peak, the closet door suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang, and everything went silent. A few seconds later, the paralysis lifted. They ran to their parents' room, begging their father to check the closet. The father searched the entire room but found nothing, reassuring them it was just sleep paralysis, but the experience left them deeply disturbed. Years ago, another individual experienced a sleep paralysis episode that would haunt them forever. They woke up in the middle of the night, immediately sensing an evil presence in their closet. They knew they were dreaming and tried to face their fear. They tried not to look directly at the closet, but no matter how hard they tried, their head and eyes felt pulled toward the dark opening. When they finally woke up in a cold sweat, they felt massive relief. But they quickly realized it was not a dream. They were lying flat on their back and could not move. They could not hear it, but they could physically feel a sickening laughter wash over them in waves, coming directly from the closet. Suddenly, out of the darkness, a heavy object was thrown at them, landing with a thud on their chest, face up. It was a severed human head, and the face belonged to a girl they had known in high school. Up until this point, they had been terrified but calm. Now they lost it. They tried to scream, but only raspy grunts and moaning noises escaped. They wriggled and strained, trying to rock from side to side to get the head off, but their limbs refused to respond. This agonizing struggle lasted for several minutes, before they finally woke up for real. The experience was so deeply traumatic that for weeks afterward, they would wake up terrified that they were still trapped in a dream, waiting for something horrible to happen at any second. Then there are the cases that defy all logical explanation. where sleep paralysis seems to act as a premonition of the future. One person experienced sleep paralysis only 3 times in their life. The first 2 times were very standard, involving nothing more than waking up and being unable to move. But the third time was entirely different. They woke up early in the morning, around 5 or 6 a.m., just as the very first rays of dawn were starting to peer through the window. The room was mostly dark, with just a faint gray light. The familiar, helpless feeling of paralysis set in immediately. As they lay there, unable to move, they suddenly heard heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs leading to their bedroom. The bedroom door opened, and in walked their brother, sister, father, and mother. All 4 of them were sobbing hysterically, their faces twisted in grief. Not only that, but they appeared to be unnaturally tall, standing at least a foot taller than their normal height, their heads nearly touching the ceiling. The 4 towering figures walked over to the side of the bed, standing over them and crying. The person wanted to scream for help, but they could not make a sound. Just as quickly as they had arrived, all 4 family members turned around and walked back down the stairs. The moment they left, the paralysis lifted. The person ran downstairs to find them, but the living area was empty. They went to each of their bedrooms, only to find all 4 of them fast asleep. A few days later, this same person was crossing the street with some friends when they were suddenly struck by a speeding car. They suffered 3 broken bones and a fractured thigh bone, resulting in a week-long hospitalization. At one point during their recovery, they opened their eyes to see their brother, sister, father, and mother all standing right next to their hospital bed, looking down at them. Their mother was crying hysterically. It was the exact same image and positioning they had witnessed in their sleep paralysis episode, just days before. Our final case takes us to the summer of 2016. A group of friends was out late, walking through their neighborhood when one of them spotted someone hiding in a bush. It was bizarre, a person just sitting silently in the dark foliage. When they got too close, a weird, off-putting sound started coming from the bush, so they all screamed, laughed, and ran away, assuming whoever was in that bush was just messing with people. The protagonist of this story went home, crawled into bed, and fell asleep easily, aided by the alcohol. But hours later, they woke up in the pitch blackness of their bedroom. They could not move. The familiar dread of sleep paralysis washed over them. As they tried to look around using only their eyes, they suddenly heard a sound. It was the exact same off-putting, robotic noise they had heard, coming from the bush earlier that night. They looked straight in front of them at the foot of their bed, and what they saw was pure nightmare fuel. It was what appeared to be the floating, grotesque, and horrific head of a demonic, ghost-like thing. As it got closer, they realized it was not floating. There was a body, but its body blended in perfectly with the blackness of the room. Its mouth hung wide open, and it just kept making the familiar noise from the bush. It got mere inches from their face before it suddenly just faded away. The person let out a loud scream, regained control of their body, and immediately flicked on the bedside lamp, searching the room. There was nothing there. The next day, they told their parents about the terrifying encounter. While their parents agreed it was likely sleep paralysis, the connection to the real-life encounter in the bush, earlier that night, left a chilling question that science could not easily answer. All of these accounts show us that the human mind is capable of experiencing things that feel incredibly real, blurring the line between dreams and reality. Whether these occurrences are simple neurological glitches or something far more mysterious, they leave a lasting impact on those who live through them. We may never truly understand what happens in those dark, quiet, and frozen moments of the night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back in 2016, I was in my senior year of high school. It was the very last week of school, so everything was laid back. The grades were already turned in, and everyone was just waiting for graduation. My friend, who everyone called Moose, was cutting class with me. We decided to hang out in my car in the senior parking lot to smoke. While we were sitting there, our friend Mario, who was in the lunchroom, texted me to come chill with him. So, Moose and I got out and started walking back toward the building. We decided to enter through one of the discreet back doors of the school, the one right by the band and chorus rooms. Just as we were about to walk inside, Mario texted again, saying the school was going into a lockdown. At first, we did not think much of it. We pulled on the back door, and to our surprise, it was still unlocked. We stepped inside, and that was when we noticed the red lockdown lights flashing in the tiny band hallway. The hallway was quiet. This was the quietest section of the school, with very little foot traffic, because it was far from the regular classrooms. I immediately took out my phone and texted Mario. I asked him what was going on and if this was just a drill. Moose and I stood there in the dim corridor waiting for his reply. A few seconds later, Mario texted back. He wrote, "Dude, holy," and then he stopped. On my screen, the typing bubble appeared. Moose and I stared at the screen, holding our breath. We watched those 3 dots dance for about 30 seconds, and then suddenly they disappeared. No text came through. I quickly typed out 3 question marks and hit send, but I did not get a response. At this point, we did not know what to do. The main hallway lights had been automatically shut off. The only things lighting up the corridor were the dim emergency backup lights and the rhythmic red flashing of the lockdown sirens. There were no teachers around. We walked over to the auditorium doors and tried to open them, but they were already locked tight. Just as we turned away, Moose tapped my shoulder. He did not say a word. He just pointed down the long hallway. Way down at the other end, I could see a figure. Someone dressed in all black was speed-walking directly in our direction. At first, in the dim, red-tinted light, I thought it was just a teacher. But as the person got closer, our stomachs dropped. We realized the person was wearing some kind of mask. Moose and I instinctively started walking backward. The figure was moving with an intense, aggressive energy. As they got closer, we could clearly see the mask. It was a pale, rotting, horrific face. It looked like a decayed corpse. It was completely disgusting and terrifying. The person was now far too close. They were moving toward us with clear, violent intent. Moose and I did not wait. We spun around and started sprinting back toward the band room. We prayed that the band teacher, Miss Bryant, would be inside and could let us in. We reached the door and started pounding on it, but there was no answer. We did not have time to wait. We had to split up. Moose ran one way and I ran the other. I saw a small music department closet. I pulled the door open, stepped inside, and quietly shut it. I turned off the light and squeezed myself behind a large plastic equipment container. The closet door had a glass window. Because the hallway was lit by the pulsing red emergency lights, I could see out. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching. I immediately ducked my head down behind the container, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the closet door. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. I slowly peeked my head up to look through the glass window. The man in the pale, rotting mask was standing right outside the door, staring directly through the glass. I instantly ducked back down, hoping he had not seen me. Then I heard the creak of the closet door opening. The man stepped inside. I could hear him rustling around, trying to find the light switch. But because the closet was dark, he could not find it. After a few terrifying seconds, he gave up. I heard his heavy footsteps quickly walk away. Once the footsteps faded, I pulled out my phone with trembling hands. I saw a long text message from Mario. He explained that a student had just been stabbed in one of the bathrooms by a masked man carrying a blade. My heart stopped. Then, a message from Moose came through. He said he was all right. He had run back outside and was safe inside his car. I realized staying in the school was way too dangerous. I waited to make sure the hallway was empty, and then I sprinted out of the closet, through the back door, and straight to my car. I sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and watched as cop cars began to swarm the school. At least 10 police officers rushed into the building. Moose came over and got into my car. We watched for over half an hour. The school was eventually let out early, with police officers escorting the students out of the building. The police never found the masked man inside the school that day. It was highly likely that he escaped through one of the back doors. Helicopters searched the surrounding woods and neighborhoods all day, but they never caught him. To this day, he was never identified. I still thank my lucky stars that I decided to hide when I did, and that I did not end up in that bathroom. Now, you would think a school lockdown is a rare, once-in-a-lifetime event. But for students in other parts of the country, it was a terrifyingly regular occurrence. Take this second story, which unfolded a few years later at a high school in a low-income neighborhood. This school was located in a rough area, which meant that security drills were a regular part of life. The students were used to fire drills and lockdown drills, and they knew the protocol by heart. Whenever the alarm sounded, the teacher would lock the classroom door, turn off the lights, and everyone would quietly huddle in the far corner of the room, away from the windows. It was a cold day during the third quarter of the school year. The windows of the classroom were shut tightly to keep out the chill. The teacher was in the middle of a lesson when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. From somewhere outside, we could hear the faint sound of shouting. It was a chaotic, angry commotion. The teacher walked over to the window to see what was happening. He opened the window slightly, but by the time he did, the shouting seemed to stop. But just as he was about to close the window, the loudspeaker crackled to life. The dean's voice came through, announcing that the school was immediately going into a lockdown. The teacher did not hesitate. He rushed to the door, locked it, and turned off the lights. The students quickly moved to the designated corner of the room, packing themselves together in the dark. Time seemed to slow down as we sat there in the silence. Suddenly, a series of blood-curdling screams echoed from the hallway. These were not the high-pitched screams of students. They were deep, raw, and angry screams of an adult man. It was the same voice we had heard outside. Someone dangerous was inside the building. Because our school was underfunded, we did not have any security guards. We were completely on our own until the police arrived. The screams in the hallway grew closer. Then we heard heavy, violent bangs on a nearby classroom door. We could hear the terrified screams of the children in the next room. The footsteps started moving toward our door. The screaming was right outside our classroom now. Suddenly, the door rattled violently as someone began slamming their weight against it. A couple of kids in our room started to cry. The man on the other side of the door was completely out of his mind. He kept screaming nonsensical things, shouting that he was sick of it, and telling everyone to just stop already. Then, we heard a loud, sickening crash. The man had smashed his elbow right through the small, thin glass window of our classroom door. The glass shattered onto the floor. Through the shattered window, a hand and arm reached into the classroom. The man was groping around, trying to find the lock on the inside of the door, but our teacher did not panic. He calmly walked over to his desk, grabbed a pair of heavy metal scissors, and walked straight toward the door. Without hesitation, he drove the scissors into the intruder's arm. The man let out a howl of pain. He pulled his bleeding arm back out. He slammed his body against the door a few more times in pure rage, and then we heard him run down the hallway, crying out in pain. A few minutes later, police arrived. At least 6 police cruisers pulled up, and officers quickly apprehended the intruder. It turned out the man was suffering from a severe mental health crisis. While he was not armed with a gun, his intentions were clear, and he was immediately taken to a mental hospital. But there is one sound that every student dreads more than anything else: the sound of a gunshot. And that brings us to our third story, which happened at a high school in California. Like most schools there, they held a mandatory lockdown drill once every month, so the students never took them seriously. But on this afternoon, the alarm went off, and it was definitely not a drill. I was in the cafeteria during my lunch period, when the teacher in charge of the room grabbed the microphone. He ordered everyone to be quiet. He sounded genuinely terrified, and his voice was shaking. He announced that the school was going into a lockdown. The entire room went dead silent. Everyone looked around with wide, nervous eyes, and then a loud, echoing crack shattered the silence. It was the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Complete panic erupted. Some kids ran for the exits. The teacher on the microphone screamed for everyone to hide under the tables as he locked the heavy cafeteria doors and shut off all the lights. My friends and I scrambled under a table, our hearts pounding. We lay flat against the floor, waiting in the dark. Suddenly, a wave of screams broke out across the room. We peeked out and saw a student with a gun standing right outside the locked glass door. He started shooting directly at the glass door. The glass cracked but did not shatter immediately. The entire lunchroom cleared out through the side exit doors. We ran out into the open air, sprinting as fast as we could. Students ran to their cars or off the property into the neighborhood. I lived close to the school, so I ran all the way home. As I ran, I saw police cars already speeding toward the campus. When I got home, my dad turned on the news. Miraculously, Only one girl was wounded in the attack, and the police were able to apprehend the shooter alive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a certain kind of quiet in the middle of the night. If you have ever worked late, you know what I mean. For many, driving is just a way to make extra cash. That was the case for an Uber Eats driver. Saturday nights were the busiest because everyone ordered food late. It was a simple routine of picking up food and dropping it off. But one Saturday night at around 1 in the morning, this simple routine turned into a nightmare. He got a request at 1 in the morning to pick up McDonald's for a guy named Kyle. It was a small order, just 2 hamburgers. The customer lived a few minutes away, so the driver grabbed the food and followed the directions. The app eventually led him down a short dead-end street. The house was the last one on this dark road, sitting right next to a line of trees that ran alongside a highway. The house itself was pitch black. Because it was so late, he did not want to ring the bell. He called Kyle, but it went straight to voicemail. Then he got a text telling him to come to the door. He walked up to the front porch, and soon the door opened. A bald man in his 30s stood there. He was drunk, and his breath smelled terrible. Kyle asked the driver to place the food on the kitchen table while he went to the basement to grab a tip. The driver stepped inside the dark kitchen, which smelled absolutely putrid. Since Kyle was taking a long time, the driver began to wander. He stepped into the adjacent living room, which was only lit by a flickering television screen. The smell here was even worse. He noticed that the sliding back glass door was open a crack. Needing fresh air, the driver walked over to the door and stepped out onto the back deck. Suddenly, a motion-sensing light clicked on, revealing 2 large heavy-duty black garbage bags. They were stuffed with 2 long, bulky objects. The plastic was stretched tight, and a swarm of flies was buzzing around them. The smell of death was undeniable. Realizing what was in those bags, the driver panicked. He rushed back inside to the front door. Just as his hand reached the knob, Kyle emerged from the basement holding some bills. He saw the driver and asked where he was going. The driver lied, saying he had to check something in his car. Kyle handed him the cash, but then he looked past him at the back deck where the floodlight was still shining. His smile faded. He asked in a cold, firm voice if the driver had gone out back. The driver said no, but Kyle did not believe him. He lunged forward and grabbed the driver's shoulder. The driver yanked his arm away, ran to his car, and locked the doors. He saw Kyle run back inside and emerge with a massive metal rod, sprinting straight for the car. The driver sped away and immediately called the police. The police arrived in under 2 minutes. They caught Kyle right in the middle of dragging those heavy black bags into the thick bushes of his backyard. It turned out the bags contained 2 actual human bodies. If the driver had stayed in that dark kitchen waiting for his tip for just a minute longer, he might have been his next victim. That case was a terrifying example of how quickly a simple food delivery can turn into a brush with a killer. But sometimes the danger does not come from a direct confrontation. Sometimes it comes in the form of something bizarre and unexplainable. This is exactly what happened to another delivery driver who worked for an Asian eatery. His friend usually worked the counter and took calls, while he did the deliveries, which was exactly the way he liked it. One busy evening, his friend got off the phone and told him he had a delivery ready. He was handed a brown paper bag and set off. The address led him down a small, overgrown dirt driveway off the main road, onto an enclosed property. It was some old, unkempt excuse of a property, and the house itself seemed completely closed off. There was not a single light on anywhere inside, and the grass was incredibly tall. When the driver got out of his car, he could feel the thick grass rubbing against his shins. The entire house looked completely abandoned, and it looked like a place that had been deserted for years. Unsure of what to do, the driver sat in his car and called his friend back at the restaurant. His friend handed the phone to their boss. The boss, who was notoriously stubborn, did not want to lose out on a sale. He yelled at the driver, telling him to stop wasting time, get out of the car, and knock on the door. Realizing he had no choice, the driver sighed, opened his car door, and stepped out. He walked through the tall grass and climbed the 3 wooden steps to the front door. He noticed there was no doorknob on the door. He had to knock loudly on the bare wood. He waited, but there was no response, so he went back to his car. He sat in his driver's seat and pulled out his phone to text his friend, but just as he started typing, he happened to look up at the second story of the house. To his surprise, a light had suddenly turned on in one of the upstairs windows. Someone was definitely inside. He climbed back out of his car and walked back up the wooden steps. He raised his hand and knocked. On his very first knock, the door creaked open a few inches. It had not been latched shut. The driver pushed the door open a little wider and called out. His voice echoed hollowly through the dark, empty hallway. The house was completely quiet. Normally, if you open a door for a delivery, you wait right there. But since the door had opened, the driver assumed the customer wanted him to come inside. He took a hesitant step into the house. The wooden floors creaked loudly under his shoes. He called out again, announcing that he had their food. This time, a muffled voice responded from somewhere upstairs. The voice spoke in Spanish, saying the words "aquí arriba." The driver knew that "aquí" meant here and "arriba" meant above. He put the two together and realized the person was telling him to come upstairs. In the middle of the hallway, there was a dark staircase. The driver walked over to the bottom step and looked up. At the very top of the stairs, a pale arm reached out from behind the wall ledge. The arm began making a stiff, repetitive beckoning motion. The driver, wanting to get this weird delivery over with, called out that he had the food as he walked up the steps. But as he reached the halfway point, the arm suddenly withdrew. When he reached the top landing, the hallway was almost completely dark. He looked around for the person. That was when he noticed a bedroom door just a few feet away. The room inside was pitch black. But as he stared into the darkness, he saw the pale arm reach out from the doorway once again. It was making that same stiff, unsettling beckoning motion. It was an incredibly creepy sight because the arm was the only thing visible. The rest of the person's body was completely shrouded in the deep shadows of the room, as if they were deliberately hiding. The driver froze. A wave of intense fear washed over him. He realized that something was deeply wrong. He stood his ground in the hallway and spoke in a firm, confident voice. He told the person that he was not going to step inside that dark room. He said they needed to come out with the money, or he was going to leave. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the arm quickly pulled back into the darkness. A moment later, a heavy, solid object flew out of the bedroom and struck the driver directly in the chest. It fell to the floor with a thud. The driver looked down and realized it was not a toy. It was a real, cold, stiff, severed human arm. The driver screamed, dropped the bag of food, and bolted down the stairs. He ran out of the house, jumped into his car, and sped down the dirt driveway. He did not stop until he reached the neighboring house. He ran to the front door and rang the doorbell. An older woman answered, looking very confused. The driver, hyperventilating and shaking, explained what had just happened. The woman looked at him with sheer horror and said that nobody had lived in that house for over a year. The police were called immediately, but whoever threw that arm had already vanished. But of all the dangers late-night delivery drivers face, the most calculated are the ones involving traps. In the rural areas of New Jersey, the roads can become incredibly isolated. This is the setting for our final story, which happened to a college student taking a gap year. To make money, he worked as a delivery driver at Domino's. On weekends, they closed at 3 in the morning. His boss always threw him on the late shift from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. There would always be 3 people working that late. On this night, the cook was Jeff, a 28-year-old Italian guy who worked 2 jobs. He was always in a bad mood, so when he told the driver to deliver something, he did it without complaints. Around 2:30 in the morning, just 30 minutes before the store was scheduled to close, they got a late phone call. The driver was told to deliver 2 pizzas to Crocker Drive. He loaded the boxes into his beat-up Honda Civic and took off down the road. It was only a 5-minute drive, but it felt much longer. He lived in the Manchester Township area, which contains nothing but dense trees and empty forests. Once you merged off the main highway onto the smaller back roads, there were absolutely no street lights. The only light that could be seen for miles was the yellow beam of his car's headlights cutting through the dark. Eventually, the GPS instructed him to turn onto a narrow private dirt road. As his car rolled down the dirt path, he suddenly heard a loud, violent bang. This was immediately followed by a flopping sound and a complete loss of steering control. The driver knew instantly that he had a flat tire. He brought the car to a stop and got out to inspect the damage. Sure enough, the front right tire was completely flat. Through his headlights, he could see the house was just a short walk ahead. He decided to deliver the pizzas first and then ask the customer for help. He walked up to the house, which was completely surrounded by dense trees. The lights inside were on, but the blinds were tightly shut. He rang the doorbell, and a normal-looking young man answered. The driver handed over the pizzas, took the money, and explained the tire situation. The man looked genuinely concerned and offered to help change the tire. They walked back down the driveway together. The man bent down, looked at the tire, and told the driver that he just needed to go inside to grab some tools. The driver started to wonder what he could have hit on a simple dirt driveway. He walked a little further down the road, looking at the ground. The customer noticed and yelled out to him, telling him not to worry about it. But the driver kept walking. A few yards down the road, his eyes caught something in the dirt. He reached down and examined it. It was a small, homemade spike strip. There was absolutely no reason for a spike strip to be lying in the middle of a private driveway, unless it had been placed there deliberately to trap whoever drove down it. A cold wave of fear washed over the driver. He realized the customer had intentionally popped his tire to trap him on the property. He knew he had to play it cool. He stood up, pretended he had not seen anything, and walked back to the car. He told the man that he did not see any debris. The man stared at him with a strange, suspicious look, then turned and went inside to get his tools. The driver waited until the man's back was turned, then jumped into his car, locked the doors, and threw the transmission into reverse. He slammed on the gas, backing out of the driveway as fast as he could while carefully steering around the spike strip. The flat tire wobbled and banged violently against the dirt road. As he reached the main road, he took one last look down the driveway. In the rearview mirror, he saw the young man running out of the house. The man was sprinting at full speed, chasing after the reversing car. The driver did not hesitate. He threw the car into drive and stepped on the gas, forcing the damaged wheel to spin. He had to drive slow enough to not completely destroy his wheel, but fast enough to outrun the man. He kept his speed at around 15 miles per hour. In his rearview mirror, he could see the silhouette of the man running down the dark road after him, but the distance between them slowly grew until the man finally vanished. It was a grueling, tense, 20-minute drive back to the Domino's store. When he finally pulled into the parking lot, the store was just 10 minutes away from closing. He walked inside, carrying the car top sign, and told Jeff and the other female employee what had happened. They were completely shocked. Jeff told him to just leave his car parked there and drive home slowly, since he lived just a few blocks away. The staff closed up the shop and drove off. The driver sat in his car for a few minutes, trying to calm down. Eventually, he started his slow drive home, but as he drove down the quiet, empty streets, he noticed a car behind him. The car was driving with its headlights completely turned off, tailing him closely. He realized the man must have followed him. He pulled over to see if the car would pass. The mysterious car slowly drove past him, but then pulled over on the same side of the street, just a short distance ahead. The driver knew he could not go home and show this person where he lived. He immediately called the police. Within 10 minutes, a police cruiser slowly rolled down the street. The driver honked his horn to get the officer's attention. The cop pulled up alongside him. The driver pointed to the dark car parked just ahead of them, but the moment the driver pointed, the dark car suddenly accelerated, zooming away with its lights still off. The cop immediately turned on his sirens and sped off in pursuit. The driver never found out if the cop caught the man, but he made sure to watch his back every single day after that. 2 months later, he quit his job. Late-night delivery drivers navigate the quietest, most vulnerable hours of the night to bring us food, putting their trust in complete strangers. But as these stories show, the dark streets hold secrets that most of us will never have to face. From deranged murderers trying to hide evidence, to abandoned houses, harboring terrifying and grotesque physical threats, to calculated traps set in the dark pine forests, the dangers are incredibly real. These drivers were lucky to survive and tell their stories, but they will never look at a late-night delivery order the same way again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you spend over 3 decades working deep underground, you see things that most people could never even imagine. For 35 long years, a man named Robert worked as a station manager for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City. Because the subway system operates 24 hours a day, there always has to be a manager on duty at all times. Robert was a dedicated worker, which meant he had done just about every shift imaginable throughout his career. But his absolute least favorite was the night shift. Most of the trains were completely empty throughout the night, which was peaceful but often incredibly eerie. The platforms were silent, and the only sound was the distant dripping of water or the scurrying of rats along the tracks. He had his fair share of strange stories, but there was one specific night shift that was downright horrifying. It was around 3 in the morning, and Robert had just boarded a train to move to his office at another station. He was completely alone in the car when he got on, but at the next station, a tall, skinny white man wearing a heavy winter jacket and a beanie stepped inside. The man shot Robert a quick glance before sitting in the furthest corner away from him. Robert immediately felt uncomfortable as the guy kept staring at him every few seconds. When Robert's stop arrived, he got off the train, and to his dismay, the other man got off as well. Robert walked quickly to his office door, unlocked it, and looked behind him. The man in the jacket was pacing around only 50 feet away. Robert stepped into his office, shut the heavy door, locked it, and sat at his desk. 5 minutes later, someone began to turn the doorknob. When they realized the door was locked, they started to knock softly on the glass. Robert called out, asking who was there. A voice from the other side responded that they just wanted to talk. Robert told him to go away, knowing trouble when he saw it. The man continued to knock for 5 minutes. Finally, Robert pulled up the security camera screens and pointed the camera to his office door. Sure enough, there was the guy from the train. But as soon as Robert brought up the camera, the man walked away into the shadows. Robert worked in his office for about half an hour before leaving to catch the next train. He checked the camera to make sure the weird guy was gone, then locked up and walked down the stairs to the platform. He boarded the train immediately, but looking out the window, he saw the same man walking down the stairs. The man stepped into the exact same car and sat down a few seats away. Robert tried to look away and pretend not to notice, but he knew the guy was staring. At one point, Robert gave a slight nod and a smile in a truce attempt, but the man just stared back. He did not blink. His eyes were wide and blank, making Robert realize this person was deeply disturbed. The man stared the entire ride. Robert was a large man, but he was a total teddy bear and feared the guy might be armed. When the train stopped, Robert practically ran to the street level, constantly looking over his shoulder. The man was following him. Robert ran into an open Wendy's and sat down. The man walked up to the window, stopped, and stared Robert down through the glass for 10 seconds before walking away across the street. Later, Robert left to get to his third and final station. While sitting in his office there, checking the security cameras out of paranoia, he caught the guy pacing around 30 feet from his office. The man stopped, looked up at the camera, and literally froze, staring for a full minute. Then, he lowered his head and walked away into the night, never to be seen again. Robert still has no idea what that man wanted, or how he managed to track him to that final station. And so, while some subway encounters involve persistent stalkers, others are highly coordinated traps designed to target helpful citizens. Around Christmas time, a young man and his 3 friends were visiting New York City. They stayed out enjoying the city lights until about 2 in the morning before finally deciding to head home. They caught the first train they could find, which, as expected, was completely empty. As they sat in the quiet car, they suddenly heard a loud commotion in the next car over. Peeking through the glass window between the cars, they saw 2 hooded teenagers standing obnoxiously close to a woman who was screaming for help. The group wanted to intervene and help her, but as they got a closer look, they saw that the teenagers were armed with handguns. Realizing the danger, they decided to flee. They pushed through the heavy doors to the next car, trying to put distance between themselves and the armed men. But as they ran, one of the gunmen pointed at them and began to follow. The friends ran through 3 different cars, with the men hot on their heels before the train finally screeched to a halt at the next station. They all bolted out of the train and ran into the old, sprawling station to find a place to hide. In the chaos, the narrator got separated from his friends. Hearing the heavy thud of footsteps on the tile floor, he knew he had no time to find a better hiding spot. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it would give him away. He was sweating despite the cold winter air flowing through the entrance of the station. He quickly dove behind a large metal garbage can and crouched down, peering through the opening at the top of the bin. The two pursuers walked into view. One was black, the other was Indian, and both looked very young. The narrator assumed they were just trying to rob them, until he heard one of them say that if they found them, they should just kill them. Hearing this, the narrator gasped in terror, nearly knocking the heavy garbage bin over and giving away his position. By some miracle, the men did not notice and walked away. The narrator ran in the opposite direction and quickly reunited with his friends, who were hiding behind a large concrete pillar. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As they watched from their hiding spot, they saw the very same woman who had been screaming for help walk casually over to the two men. She asked them where the friends had gone and why they had let them get away. The entire incident was a coordinated setup, with the woman acting as bait. The friends stayed hidden until the group left, then called the police to report the dangerous trap. But perhaps the most terrifying encounters of all are the ones that wait in the pitch-black tunnels, where light never reaches. A 22-year-old named Danny lived in New York City. Since he did not own a car, he relied entirely on the subway system, even late at night. One Saturday night, Danny was heading home from a party in the middle of the night. He walked down the concrete steps into a tightly spaced, isolated station. The tiles on the walls were cracked and dirty. The silence was heavy, and he felt an uncomfortable sensation of being watched. He could also hear a strange, echoing, metallic banging sound coming from deep inside the train tunnel. Since he was early for his train, Danny sat down on a concrete bench to wait. Suddenly, a raspy voice called out from the dark tunnel entrance, telling him to look over. Danny looked and saw a filthy man in his early 40s poking his head out of the tunnel. The man gave Danny a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 missing teeth. Danny tried his best to ignore him and look away, but then loud laughter echoed from the darkness. It was a wet, raspy laugh that made goosebumps break out all over Danny's arms. He gripped his phone tightly. A second disheveled man poked his face out of the tunnel, smiling nastily and inviting Danny to come hang out with them in the darkness. Their eyes were wide, completely locked onto him without moving. Danny kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, praying for his train to arrive. In his peripheral vision, he saw one of the men step back into the dark tunnel, only to return a moment later. Danny looked over and felt his stomach drop. The man was holding up a third face, but this face was completely lifeless and slumped over at an unnatural angle. It looked like the men were holding up a dead body to show him. Just then, the loud screech of an approaching train echoed through the station. Danny felt a massive wave of relief. He stood up, ready to board, but as he stepped closer to the edge of the platform, he looked down into the tunnel one last time. The two men were retreating back into the darkness, but the man in the back was holding something by the hair. It was a freshly decapitated human head. Danny was frozen in pure horror. As the train stopped, he threw himself into the first car. He ran straight to the conductor's door and began knocking like a madman, screaming that there was a horrific emergency. As the train began to pull out of the station, Danny looked out the window into the dark tunnel. For a split second, he caught a glimpse of a group of men huddled against the safety railing, just inches from the moving train window, and every single one of them was staring directly at him. The conductor opened the door, and Danny frantically explained what he had just seen. The conductor immediately radioed transit authority and the police. Danny got off at his stop, relieved to be alive, and has never used that station late at night again. The secrets that hide in the dark tunnels of the subway are sometimes far too terrifying to face. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In high school, keeping up with friends online is everything. For most teenagers, apps like Snapchat are just a normal part of daily life. You use it to send quick photos, share jokes, and keep in touch. But a few years ago, the app introduced a feature called Snap Maps. If you had it turned on, anyone on your friend list could see your exact location on a map in real time. Most people did not think twice about it. They just wanted their friends to see they were busy or hanging out somewhere cool. It seemed like a fun, harmless way to stay connected. But the truth is, this simple feature was about to turn several teenagers' lives into absolute living nightmares. At this school, there was a kid named Zach. Zach had been a socially awkward reject since elementary school. No one really knew if he had any specific issues, but everyone agreed there was always something off-putting and unpleasant about him. One cold December day, the narrator got a notification that Zach Meister added him as a friend on Snapchat. The narrator decided to add him back because he was just too friendly of a person. That was his first mistake. Minutes later, Zach sent him a picture and a video. The narrator waited a few hours to show as much disinterest as possible before opening them. When he finally did, it was weirder than he thought. The first picture was of the narrator sitting in the lunchroom. The video showed the moment the bell rang and everyone got up. The camera zoomed in on the narrator, recording him as he left the lunchroom. The caption at the bottom read, "Acute ulul." The narrator ignored it, even though he was close to unfriending him. Later that night, the narrator was watching television in his bedroom and messaging other friends. Suddenly, a message from Zach popped up. By reflex, the narrator tapped the notification. Immediately opening the chat, the message from Zach asked a direct question. "You live on Mason Street." The narrator, caught off guard, replied with a simple yes. Zach answered back instantly. This time, the narrator decided he would not open the chat. He planned to leave it unread for a long time. But Zach did not stop. He kept sending message after message, and then he started sending pictures. The narrator turned his phone screen down on his desk, turned off his television, and went to sleep, hoping the silence would discourage Zach. The next morning, the narrator woke up and immediately felt a freezing draft. He looked up and saw that his bedroom window was wide open. He looked over to his closet, and the door was wide open too. He mumbled to himself in confusion, because he knew he had closed both of them before going to bed. He picked up his phone and saw a long list of new notifications from Zach. A terrible feeling settled in his chest. He opened Snapchat and went straight to Zach's messages. There was a series of photos. The first was a picture of the sidewalk outside. The next was a picture of the narrator's house. Then, a picture of the bedroom window from the outside. The next photo was taken through the window, showing the narrator asleep in his bed. The next photo showed Zach standing inside the bedroom. The final photo was taken from inside the closet, looking out at the narrator sleeping in his bed. Zach had actually climbed through his window, walked around his room, and stood inside his closet while he slept. There were also many text messages. Zach asked why it took so long to answer, and said he was going to come visit because the narrator had his Snap Map turned on. He wrote that he liked watching people sleep. The narrator screenshotted the chat, but did not think to screenshot the disappearing photos in time. He blocked Zach and told his parents. His dad immediately contacted the police, which turned into a big investigation that got the school involved. Apparently, Zach lived with a single alcoholic father, which explained a lot. The screenshots of Zach admitting he found the narrator via Snap Maps served as enough proof to get him charged with juvenile breaking and entering. No one ever saw Zach at school again after that, and it was assumed they moved far away. But this was not the only time a high school student found themselves targeted through the app. In another town, a different student had been using Snapchat for about a year to share funny moments from his daily life. At his school, there was a notorious student named Alex. Alex was known for acting like a complete psycho, once even putting a dead rat in another student's locker as a prank. Because of his bowl cut and extremely pale skin, students called him Vampire Bill. He had a long history of school suspensions for aggressive behavior. One afternoon, the narrator of this second story was playing video games when his phone buzzed. It was a notification from Alex. The narrator did not remember adding him, but he realized they were connected on the app because he had put his Instagram link in his bio, which contained his snap code. He put his phone down and kept playing his game. Once his character died, he picked up his phone to see what Alex had sent. It was a highly zoomed in photo of a door handle and a locking mechanism. The caption simply said, "Hello." The narrator felt a chill. He knew Alex was unstable and capable of showing up at someone's house. He screenshotted the image and replied, asking why he sent it. Alex immediately replied with another picture. This one was a blurry photo taken through a window, looking directly into a kitchen. The narrator froze as he recognized his own family kitchen. The narrator took a screenshot of the kitchen photo and ran out of his bedroom straight to the kitchen. He looked out the window and saw Alex standing on his deck, laughing. He ran to the dining room door and threw it open. Alex was standing right there, but he was holding his hand behind his back. The narrator yelled at him to get off the property. Instead of leaving, Alex slowly brought his hand out from behind his back. He was holding a large kitchen knife. The narrator slammed the heavy dining door shut, locked it immediately, and screamed through the glass that he was calling the police. Alex just smiled a wide, unsettling smile and slowly walked off the deck. The narrator ran around the entire house, ensuring every single door and window was locked. He never found out what Alex would have done if the door had not been locked in time, but the memory stayed with him forever. The third case happened just a couple of days ago to a young man who shared his life online. He had a large following on Instagram because he lived a fairly lavish lifestyle and posted pictures of his family's expensive sports cars, high-end watches, and designer clothes. Because of this, he often put his Snapchat username in his Instagram bio, leading to many random friend requests. One rainy night, while hanging out with a friend, he received 2 new friend requests from accounts named Casey Welsh and Bree Owens. He added them both back. He noticed they both had incredibly low Snap scores, one with only 200 points and the other with a few thousand. He thought it was strange because low scores usually mean fake or burner accounts, but he did not worry too much. Later, the account named Casey sent him a snap with a black screen and a caption saying, "You're cute." He decided to ignore it, suspecting someone was playing a joke on him. He opened his Snap map out of curiosity and noticed that both Casey and Bree had their locations turned on. They were apparently together in a car, parked only a short distance away from his current location. When it was time for the young man to go home, the storm outside had worsened. The rain was heavy, making the roads slick and dark. He got into his car and merged onto the highway, driving slowly due to the poor visibility. The highway was empty, except for one car that eventually pulled up directly behind him. The car stayed close, matching his speed. The narrator took his town exit, and the car behind him followed. He took a left turn onto his street, and the car made the exact same turn. He pulled into his driveway and turned off his engine. The car behind him did not pass. Instead, it slowed down right in front of his house and came to a stop. His heart began to hammer in his chest. He grabbed his phone, opened Snapchat, and looked at the Snap map. The icons for Casey and Bree were parked directly on top of his house. They had tracked him home using his own shared location. The narrator was terrified. He knew his father was home, but running across the wet driveway to the front door felt too dangerous. He decided to call the house phone instead. His father answered immediately, and the narrator screamed into the receiver, begging him to come outside. As he did, he saw the mysterious car in the street begin to reverse, aligning itself closer to the driveway. Suddenly, the front door of the house flew open, and his father stepped onto the porch. At the sight of his father, the car sped off into the darkness. The narrator ran through the rain into the safety of the house. He asked his father how he knew to come out so fast, and his father asked him who those men were. The narrator was confused. His father explained that as he opened the door, he saw at least 3 large men sitting in the car watching the house. They had used fake female accounts to lure the narrator and track his location, but the nightmare did not end there. The very next night, the narrator woke up to the sound of rustling leaves and trash cans moving outside his window. He lay frozen in his bed, too, to look. Then, a low voice whispered from the darkness of his room, telling him not to move a muscle. It was his father, who had been hiding behind his bed, watching the window. They waited in silence until the footsteps outside retreated and the car drove away. When we look back at these 3 cases, a terrifying pattern emerges. Social media apps are designed to bring people together, but features like live location tracking create perfect tools for stalkers and predators. In Zach's case, a simple confirmation of an address allowed an unstable classmate to navigate directly to a teenager's bedroom window and slip inside undetected. For Alex, the vulnerability of a shared life online turned into an armed confrontation on a family deck. And for the third victim, a coordinated group of men used fake identities to stalk a wealthy target directly to his home, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These stories show how easily digital footprints can lead danger to our doors. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. If there is one thing modern technology has taught us, it is that home safety is fragile. Doorbell cameras are meant to give us peace of mind, letting us see packages or arriving friends. But sometimes they capture deeply unsettling things, revealing hidden dangers lurking right outside. These cameras show that having a suspicious stranger show up at your house at night is far more common than most of us want to believe. For example, one quiet night, a homeowner was awakened by a notification on his phone. Looking at his doorbell camera feed, he saw a man walking up his porch steps. The man was holding a plastic bag and a roll of toilet paper. It was obvious that something was wrong. His movements were twitchy and erratic, and he looked incredibly nervous. It was clear he was under the influence of a heavy drug like meth. The homeowner kept the door locked and spoke through the intercom, asking how he could help. The man on the porch had a blank, confused look, his pupils completely dilated from being heavily intoxicated. When the homeowner asked for his name, the man struggled to put his thoughts together, finally saying his name was James. When asked who he was looking for, James froze, trying to invent a story. He mumbled the name Sosa, then added Sammy like the baseball player. The homeowner did not waste time. He told James no friend of his lived there, and that he had a Glock ready if James did not get off his porch immediately. The threat of force worked, and James quickly turned around and left, leaving the homeowner safe. But while some encounters involve confused individuals, others are highly coordinated and incredibly dangerous. In another neighborhood, a home security camera caught something straight out of a nightmare. 3 masked men, all dressed in dark clothing, slowly crept up to a front door in the dead of night. The man in the lead was heavily armed, carrying what appeared to be an assault rifle. He was not there to knock or ask questions. He was preparing to break in and rob the residence. As the lead gunman got close to the door, he noticed the camera. He quickly reached out with his gloved hand and covered the lens, trying to block the view. But even though the camera was covered, the suspects made a critical mistake. Their body language, caught just before the lens was blocked, showed a lot of hesitation. The gunman with the assault rifle seemed to realize they had already been spotted. He started to back away, but one of his accomplices behind him motioned for him to go back and keep trying. Eventually, realizing they lost the element of surprise, they fled. Sometimes, the threat does not come from a random criminal, but from someone you actually know. A viewer submitted a highly disturbing video where a man is seen standing on a front porch, muttering and cursing to himself. He stood there for 15 straight minutes, pacing back and forth. The backstory is terrifying. Not long before this, a member of the homeowner's family had been viciously attacked and mauled by a pack of aggressive dogs, suffering at least 12 bite wounds. The man on the porch was the owner of those dogs. Instead of showing remorse, the dog owner was furious that the family was holding him accountable. He stood on their porch, ranting about how people did not understand things. He muttered that he never denied his dogs bit her, but he was angry that the neighbors wanted to put his dogs to sleep over what he called a simple dog bite. He even made a chilling statement, asking when he had ever threatened her, while pointing out that he knew exactly where she lived. He continued his angry, unstable rant until the police finally arrived to deal with him. Another terrifying incident shows why you must always pay attention to your surroundings. A young couple was walking back to their house after an evening out. They had no idea that a man and a woman wearing wigs had been following them for blocks. The couple made it to their front step and were about to open the door when the male suspect ran up behind them. He pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at the back of their heads. Fortunately, the couple reacted instantly. They scrambled inside their house and slammed the door shut, locking it just in time. The two attackers, realizing they had lost their chance, did not seem bothered. In fact, they laughed as they ran back to their getaway car. Just minutes after this failed attempt, They successfully robbed another person at gunpoint. Thankfully, their luck ran out. The next day, after the doorbell footage was broadcast on the news, a viewer recognized the male gunman and turned him in to the police. Sometimes, criminals try to use authority to gain access to a home. In an apartment complex, a man walked up to a door and knocked loudly. He began shouting that he was the police, hoping the resident would open up without thinking. But as he looked around, he noticed the doorbell camera pointing right at him. His face fell. He realized his disguise and his actions were being recorded in high definition. To try and cover his tracks, he muttered that he was at the wrong room and quickly walked away, hoping the excuse would save him. But perhaps the most chilling home invasion occurred on September 14th, 2022, in Virginia. An elderly couple was spending a quiet evening at home when two armed, masked men burst through their door. They had no regard for the couple's age or vulnerability. They held them at gunpoint and ordered them to get into a closet. The elderly woman was terrified, not just for herself, but for her husband. She pleaded with the robbers, explaining that her husband had recently undergone hip surgery and could not move quickly. The elderly man struggled to stand, doing his best to cooperate so they would not shoot them. He slowly made his way to the closet, feeling completely helpless. Once the couple was locked inside, the robbers moved with disturbing speed and precision. They knew exactly what they wanted. One of them grabbed a heavy safe, while the other took a wallet and the couple's cell phones. Inside that safe was tens of thousands of dollars. The money did not belong to the elderly couple, but to another individual who was staying at their residence. The fact that the robbers went straight for the safe made it clear that this was a targeted tip-off. Someone who had been inside the house, perhaps a contractor, a healthcare worker, or a casual visitor, had seen the safe and shared the information with the criminals. Police launched an intense investigation and quickly identified the two suspects as 25-year-old Mitchell Boney Jr. and 22-year-old Tyree Demons Boney Jr. Mitchell Boney Jr. eventually turned himself in to the police. He was charged with armed burglary, use of a firearm, abduction, and conspiracy to commit burglary. However, Tyree Demons Boney Jr. went on the run and managed to evade capture. The incident left the elderly couple deeply traumatized, showing how quickly a peaceful evening can turn into a nightmare, and how dangerous it is when the wrong people gain information about your home. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The holiday season is usually a time of joy, warmth, and laughter. We gather with our loved ones, exchange gifts, and enjoy the cozy atmosphere of a decorated home. But for some, the holidays bring a completely different kind of experience. An experience filled with shadows, whispers, and the realization that we are never truly safe, even inside our own homes. Let us start back in a magical and delicate age, when the belief in Santa Claus was still very much alive. It was Christmas Eve night, or technically, it was already Christmas morning. The exact hour was a mystery, but it was incredibly late, and everyone in the house was fast asleep. A young boy woke up randomly in the middle of the night. He did not know what woke him, but his throat was extremely dry. He needed a glass of water, so he climbed out of his warm bed, threw off his heavy blankets, and began the long walk downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet and dark, but there were night lights glowing in the living room and the kitchen. Because of this, he did not need to turn on any overhead lights to see where he was going. Whenever he got thirsty when he was a kid, he had this strange habit of finishing his glass of water right there in the kitchen, instead of bringing it back up to his bedroom. He just stood by the counter, sipping the cool water in the quiet house. But as he was drinking, a strange noise broke the silence. It was coming from down in the den, which was the room where the family kept their Christmas tree. The sound was like a big bag rustling. The boy stopped drinking. He peered his head around the wall that led down the stairway to the den, but it was a little too dark to see who was down there. He actually thought maybe it was his mom, so he started walking down the stairs. The moment his feet touched the steps, the rustling of the bag stopped. He turned on the couch side lamp, and there he was greeted by a massive man. He was both tall and broad, wearing a red suit and hat, with a long white beard. To the young boy, it was Santa Claus. The man waved him over, and the boy nervously but excitedly walked over to him. The man patted his head and said he was just delivering presents from his black bag. The boy looked at the bag, which seemed to be full of small boxes, and tried to get a peek inside, but the man stopped him and said it was a surprise. The boy noticed there were already some presents under the tree. The man turned him around and whispered in his ear that he needed to go back to bed. For some reason, the boy did not go. He just turned around and kept looking at him. Eventually, the man actually started walking him up the stairs, telling him that they had to be very quiet. The man asked which way his room was, and told him to go up the second flight of stairs. The boy obeyed. When he reached the top, he looked down and saw the eerie figure of the Santa Claus looking up at him. He realized the man had turned off the nightlight as they were walking up. He went to his room and shut the door, excited that he just saw Santa. As he tried to fall back asleep, he heard a loud bang from downstairs in the den. The sound traveled all the way up to his room. He assumed that was just Santa leaving. The next morning, he woke up early to his mom screaming. He ran down to the den where his parents already were. There were no presents under the tree, and the sliding window was broken. The heavy window had been slammed shut so hard that it got knocked completely off its sliding mechanism. The cold winter air was rushing into the room, making the curtains flutter wildly. He confusedly asked his parents what happened, and explained that he saw Santa. His parents frantically tried to get as much information out of him as possible. His dad called the police. The dispatcher said that 2 other calls for the same incident had already come in that morning. A man dressed as Santa Claus was targeting certain houses with accessible windows and stealing the gifts. The parents had to tell him later that day that Santa is not real, and that he should never trust anyone like that again. It was a heartbreaking realization that shattered his childhood innocence, but it was a necessary lesson to keep him safe from harm. Sometimes the threat does not find you at home, but when you are working. Our next story comes from a man who once worked as a night security guard at a large mall in Chicago. Working the graveyard shift was always difficult, but it was especially hard when he had to do it on the night of Christmas Eve. He was doing his regular patrol, pacing back and forth along the wide hallways of the mall. The silent mall felt incredibly massive in the middle of the night, and the only light came from the massive Christmas tree in the center. After getting a coffee from the security lounge, he stepped back out into the main hallway. He noticed all the way on the other side of the mall that a light was on in one of the stores. The light was definitely not on before. No one was supposed to be in the mall besides him. He jogged over to the store and set his coffee down under a plant. It was a jewelry shop. He tried opening the door, but it was locked. The lights inside the store suddenly started flickering. He assumed it was just faulty wiring, but as he knelt down to pick up his coffee, he saw someone's head behind the front counter of the jewelry store. It was just their head, like they were hiding behind the counter. One moment there was light, and the next there was darkness. When the light flickered back on, the head was gone. He rubbed his eyes and shook his head, wondering if his mind was playing tricks. He took his master key ring off his belt, looking for the key to the store, but he was too freaked out to check behind the counter with nothing but a flashlight. He decided to relock the door and walk back to his post by the giant Christmas tree to drink his coffee. As he sat there, the lights in that store remained off. But then he heard a loud click and a bang down in his direction. He looked up and saw someone running across one side of the hall to the other, before disappearing into an intersecting exit hallway. The guard sprang to his feet. He ran down the hall until he came to the smaller hallway. This area led to one of the exits and was filled with massage chairs, kiddie rides, and the public restrooms. He knew the person had to be in the restroom because all the exit doors were locked. He got to the door of the men's restroom and stopped, feeling terrified of confronting whoever was inside. He cracked the door open slightly and called out, saying that whoever was in there needed to get out before he called the police. Suddenly, he heard a strange crying and moaning sound. He opened the door fully and realized the sound was coming from one of the stalls. He repeated his warning, but the crying did not stop. He knelt down to peek under the stall door, and he saw 2 black shoes facing the door. The person was standing right there, facing the wood. The crying stopped. The next thing he saw was the person quickly drop to their knees and look under the stall door right back at him. He recognized it as the same person from behind the counter. The guard got back on his feet, ran out of the bathroom, and called the police. A couple of police officers arrived, and the guard let them in. They went into the men's bathroom, but the stall door was still locked, and the man refused to come out. Finally, the officer kicked the stall door open. They grabbed the man and began walking him out of the mall in handcuffs. As they walked him out, the man kept his head turned to look at the guard the entire time, staring with dead eyes. Right before he was put in the back of the police car, the intruder whispered the guard's actual name. The guard immediately felt a deep, terrifying chill. The officers went on their way, promising to identify the man. The guard's shift ended a few hours later, but for the rest of his time working at that mall, he lived in constant fear, always paranoid of what was around the corner. But perhaps the most terrifying holiday encounter is when the threat is already inside your own home. This final story happened last year. The narrator was 18, his older brother was 24, and their youngest sibling, Rachel, was only 2. His parents had gone away on a vacation before Christmas. The 18-year-old was left in charge of taking care of Rachel. His days consisted of watching movies, playing with her toys, and relaxing. In the evenings, he would turn off all the lights except for the Christmas tree, which made watching television on the couch feel much more comforting. When Rachel got tired, he brought her upstairs, changed her, and put her in her crib. He made sure to turn on the baby monitor so he could hear if she woke up. Rachel's bedroom shared a bathroom with their parents' room, meaning the 2 bedrooms were directly connected through that bathroom. This made the whole setup feel very open and exposed. He went back downstairs to continue watching his movie. But after a few minutes, strange sounds started coming through the baby monitor. It was not Rachel. It sounded like distorted, human-like noises that made no sense. He quickly hurried back upstairs. He opened the door so quickly that it woke Rachel up and she began to cry. He looked around the room, but everything seemed normal. He picked her up, tried to rock her back to sleep, and eventually got her to settle down. He placed her back in the crib and quietly walked out. Only a few minutes later, he heard Rachel crying again through the monitor. He ran back upstairs to see what was wrong. She was standing in her crib, pointing her tiny finger at the bathroom door. The door was cracked open, but he could not remember if it had been like that. He walked over to check the bathroom, but it was completely clear. He calmly told her she was just imagining things, and got her to settle back down to sleep. Once she was resting, he went back downstairs to the living room and sat down to continue watching TV. Suddenly, the light on the baby monitor started flashing again. He leaned in close and listened carefully. This time he could distinctly hear the low, raspy whispering of a grown man coming through the speaker. He felt a wave of absolute terror wash over him. He ran back up the stairs faster than ever and burst into the bedroom. Rachel was screaming in terror. He rushed to the crib to scoop her up into his arms, but as he turned toward the door, he looked into the dark bathroom, which was now wide open. A man was standing in his parents' room. As the narrator watched, the man stepped through the bathroom door and began walking directly toward him and Rachel. The narrator did not hesitate. He held his sister tight and ran out. He ran out of the house and straight to their neighbor Judy's house. She immediately let them inside and gave him her phone to call the police. The officers searched the house but found no one. Judy let them stay the night at her place. The next morning, Judy went back to the house with him to offer support. The home seemed completely clear. He searched everywhere, trying to find out how the intruder had managed to get inside. But there was no sign of forced entry. It made absolutely no sense how the man got in. A couple of weeks later, his parents were back, and his mother asked him to take the Christmas decorations up to the attic. He carried the heavy boxes up the pull-down stairs. As he walked to the corner to stack them, his heart stopped at what he discovered. In the deep corner of the attic, hidden behind a wall of stacked, ripped-up cardboard boxes, was a makeshift bed. There was a pile of blankets, a pillow, and empty wrappers. He felt his stomach drop as he looked down at the dark, cold floor. He realized instantly that this was where the intruder had been living. The family had absolutely no idea how long that man had been staying in their attic, watching them, and waiting for the perfect moment to slip down. It was a terrifying reminder of how vulnerable we can be, even in the place we feel safest. The holidays are meant to be a time of peace and celebration, but sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who use the cover of holiday cheer to step out of the shadows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. 2 years ago, a major milestone was reached. It was the purchase of a first house. At the time, the new homeowner was single, living alone, and completely busy with the unpacking phase. To make things easier, some close friends offered to help unload the massive moving truck. It was filled with heavy boxes and furniture, and they worked hard for hours. Since they refused money, they were paid in food, hanging around for a few hours just to relax. During this downtime, one of the friends, a guy named Dale, went to use the bathroom. When he came back, he mentioned that while he was in there, he heard some strange noises coming from inside the walls, like pipe issues. The homeowner took note of it, and soon after, the friends left. It was a Saturday night, so the homeowner stayed up pretty late on a laptop watching Netflix. But as the house grew completely quiet, some light thumping sounds began to echo from above. This was confusing because the bedroom was upstairs. The only thing above that room was the attic. That was when Dale's comment about the noises inside the walls came rushing back. Wanting to check, the homeowner walked over to the attic door. Pulling down the folding stairs, a deep breath was necessary to calm the nervous tension. Climbing up those stairs into the darkness, the homeowner pulled the hanging light switch string. A very dim, yellow bulb buzzed to life, barely lighting the space. Strangely, the moment the light turned on, all the noises in the walls stopped. Looking around, the attic appeared empty, since no boxes had been moved up there yet. The only objects in sight were 2 giant, framed paintings leaning against one of the walls. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, the homeowner went back downstairs, climbed into bed, and tried to sleep. But the thumping noises started up again, sounding closer this time. It felt like some kind of small animal, perhaps a raccoon, was trapped in the ceiling. The sounds seemed to be coming from directly above the bed. Determined to find the source, the homeowner went back up into the attic. Walking across the floorboards, it became clear that the attic did not extend the entire length of the house. There was a solid wall blocking off the section that should have been directly above the bedroom. Stepping closer to this wall to listen, the sound of movement on the other side was unmistakable. That was when the homeowner noticed the 2 large paintings leaning against that exact wall. They were positioned at a slightly odd angle. With a racing heart, the homeowner walked over and lifted one of the heavy paintings. Behind it lay a massive hole cut directly into the wall. The reality did not register immediately, but as the painting was held upright, a sudden force pushed it from the other side, knocking it completely out of the homeowner's grip to fall flat on the floor. Out from the hole emerged a sickly, gaunt young woman who seemed heavily under the influence. She was shaking, making bizarre noises, and laughing creepily. Before the homeowner could react, she lunged forward, grabbing onto the homeowner and digging her fingernails deep into their shoulders. Screaming in terror, the homeowner pushed her back as hard as possible. She stumbled backward, falling back into the dark, hidden void behind the wall. The homeowner ran down the attic stairs, slamming the door shut, and locked themselves in the bedroom, while calling the police to report that a dangerous person was in the attic. 5 police officers arrived within 5 minutes. 4 went into the attic, and a violent struggle was heard. The girl screamed like a wild animal and tried to attack the officers, which led to her getting tased. They managed to secure her in cuffs and carried her out to a patrol car. She appeared to be between 25 and 35 years old, looking extremely sickly. The homeowner went back up to examine the secret room. Inside was a pile of dirty blankets, a dirty pillow, food wrappers, and human waste. She had been living there secretly for a long time. The girl was taken to a psychiatric center to get the help she needed. Moving on to another unsettling case, we look at a young man who bought his first house at the age of 28. His wealthy father lent him a large amount of cash to make the purchase possible. The house itself had belonged to an elderly couple. The husband of the couple had passed away many years prior, and the elderly wife had died just a few weeks before the house was put up for sale. Their adult son was handling the estate. To make things easier, he left a large portion of the old furniture behind, taking only what he wanted. This was a huge relief, as it meant buying less furniture. However, some of the older pieces had a very outdated, creepy vibe. Among these items was an old rocking chair sitting in the living room. Feeling unsettled by its presence, the new owner decided to carry it out to the curb for trash collection. The next day was spent entirely on cleaning out the remaining junk from the upstairs bedrooms. It was physically demanding work, which took up almost the entire day. Suffering from a very frustrating case of mild insomnia, the new owner had not slept a single wink the night before. By the time evening arrived, exhaustion had completely taken over. Lacking the energy to cook, a decision was made to go out and get some Chinese food. But upon returning home, a wave of unease hit. The front door was completely unlocked. It felt highly unlikely to be a simple mistake. To cope with the rising anxiety, every single light on the main floor was switched on. The same process was repeated upstairs, turning on lights in the common area and all 3 bedrooms. There was also a small basement in the house, which had only been visited once before. It was just a small storage space where the washer and dryer were kept. With the upstairs lights on, the homeowner felt a bit more relaxed. But to be absolutely sure, the basement had to be checked. Opening the basement door, the light switch was flipped, and the descent down the stairs began. Halfway down, the homeowner froze in absolute shock. Sitting in the middle of the basement floor was an old rocking chair. It had not been there during the first visit. Stepping closer, the realization hit that this was the exact same rocking chair that had been hauled out to the curb the night before. There was no mistaking its unique, worn-out design. A quick scan of the dark corners revealed no one else was down there, which helped calm the rising panic. Going back upstairs to the kitchen to eat dinner, the homeowner left the basement door slightly cracked open. Almost immediately, a strange creaking sound began to echo from downstairs. It was the unmistakable sound of wood rocking back and forth. Rushing back to the basement door, the homeowner tried to flip the light switch, but it would not turn on. Grabbing a flashlight from under the sink, the homeowner crept a quarter of the way down the steps, shining the bright beam down to the bottom. The rocking chair was moving, and someone was sitting in it. It was an old woman with gray curly hair, wearing glasses and dressed in a pink nightgown. Her head slowly turned to look up. Gasps of pure terror filled the air as the homeowner scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut and calling the police immediately. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire basement, but found absolutely no one. There were also no hidden compartments or exits where she could have escaped. The officers began to look at the homeowner like they were crazy, and soon after they left. The homeowner decided to call the son of the previous owners and describe the lady. The son broke down crying, saying the description matched his deceased mother in her favorite nightgown. He came over within the hour, went downstairs, and eventually left with the rocking chair. The experience left a lasting scar, forcing the homeowner to keep the basement door locked at all times. The house was sold just a year and a half later, as the memory of that night could never be erased. Our final story takes us back to a rural area in the countryside of Louisiana, near a very small village. A 12-year-old child and their family had just moved into a spacious home situated on a private 3-acre property. Growing up in quiet areas, the family was well accustomed to isolation. On only the second night in the new house, a strange event occurred. The family dog, a loyal dog named Parker, who slept on the floor of the child's bedroom, suddenly stood up in the middle of the night. He began growling and barking aggressively, his eyes locked onto a dark corner of the room. The child sat up, calling to the dog. Parker's tail wagged, but he kept growling at the corner. The child checked the empty closet, but found nothing. After telling the dog to quiet down, Parker finally laid back down, though he spent the rest of the night lifting his head, clearly alert to something. The next morning, an older man walked up and knocked on the door. The father answered while the child watched cartoons nearby, listening. The visitor introduced himself as Gene, explaining that he was the next-door neighbor. The father called the child over to introduce themselves. Gene seemed incredibly eccentric, kooky, and aloof, behaving in a highly strange way that even a 12-year-old could immediately recognize as unusual, though he seemed nice enough. The following afternoon, the child was sitting at an outdoor table in the backyard, playing Pokemon on a Game Boy. The father was at the front of the house mowing the lawn while the rest of the family was away. Suddenly, Gene appeared, wearing a large farmer's hat and denim overalls. He walked straight into the backyard, completely ignoring any boundaries. Speaking in a thick southern accent, he asked the child what they were doing. Without invitation, Gene sat down at the table, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. When the child mentioned playing Pokemon, Gene immediately claimed to know what it was, attempting to be funny by making loud Pikachu noises. The behavior was deeply unsettling, and it became clear that something was seriously off about this man. A few moments later, the father walked into the backyard with the lawnmower, shutting it off when he saw Gene sitting next to his child. The father approached them with a polite but forced smile. He immediately instructed the child to go inside and wash the dishes, a clear excuse to get them away from the neighbor. Once inside, the father followed shortly after, asking if Gene had simply walked onto the property. When the child confirmed this, the father gave a strict warning to stay far away from him. A few nights later, the warning became a terrifying reality. The child woke up in the dead of night to the sound of Parker growling and barking furiously at the bedroom window. Creeping out of bed, the child slowly pushed the window open to listen for any noises outside. No one was visible in the yard, but suddenly, from the darkness directly below the window, Gene's voice broke the silence, making those same creepy Pikachu noises. Terrified, the child ran screaming down the hallway, calling for their father. Hearing the panic, the father grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, but the intruder had already vanished. Determined to confront the man, the father walked over to the neighboring house where Gene claimed to live. When he knocked, an older woman answered the door, looking completely confused. She explained that she lived alone and had absolutely no idea who Gene was. The father spent the next hour visiting every single neighboring house, but not a single resident had ever heard of a man matching Gene's description. The police were called to investigate, and the story even made the local news, warning residents about the unidentified man. Despite the patrols, the strange man was never seen or heard from again, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread that hung over the family for years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you travel to a new place, there is a unique kind of excitement that comes with it. You look forward to seeing the famous landmarks, eating the local food, and experiencing a completely different culture. But the problem is, when you are in a foreign country, you do not always know the rules of the road. You do not know which neighborhoods are safe. You do not know who is genuinely friendly, and you certainly do not know who might be watching you from the shadows. For the victims in today's stories, their dream vacations quickly transformed into absolute nightmares when they realized they were being targeted by silent, relentless predators. Our first story takes us to the beautiful, tropical beaches of southern Thailand. Back when the protagonist of this case was just 24 years old, they decided to take their very first solo trip completely outside of North America. After doing a lot of research online, they decided to book a trip to Thailand. It seemed like the perfect destination. It was highly affordable. The photos of the beaches looked absolutely stunning, and several of their close friends had recently visited and spoken highly of their experiences. For the first week of the vacation, everything went absolutely perfectly. The travelers spent their days bouncing around the busy, colorful streets of Bangkok and visiting a few smaller scenic beach towns along the coast. The local people were incredibly warm and welcoming. The food was spectacular, and at no point did the traveler ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable. But the entire tone of the trip shifted during the second week. The traveler had booked a 3-night stay at a very small, secluded hotel located just outside of the main town of Krabi. This property was not a massive, busy resort with hundreds of guests. Instead, it was a quiet, isolated retreat featuring about 20 separate concrete bungalows spread out across a small clearing. The geography of the hotel was beautiful but highly isolating. On 3 sides of the property was thick, dense, untamed jungle, and on the 4th side was the open ocean. The area was incredibly peaceful, which was the exact reason the traveler had chosen it in the first place. They wanted to get away from the crowds and enjoy some quiet time. On their second day at the resort, The traveler decided to rent a small scooter from a local shop so they could explore the winding coastal roads. They spent the entire afternoon riding around, feeling the warm breeze and looking at the scenery. Around sunset, they decided to pull over at a small, open-air roadside restaurant located about 20 minutes away from their hotel bungalows. The restaurant was very quiet, with only a few other patrons eating at the wooden tables. The traveler ordered some dinner, had a couple of cold beers, and enjoyed the view as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time they paid their bill and got back onto their scooter, it was completely dark outside. The road leading back to the hotel was basically one long, narrow stretch of asphalt that wrapped tightly along the dark coastline. There were absolutely no streetlights out here, and the thick jungle canopy overhead blocked out most of the moonlight. About halfway through the 20-minute ride, the traveler happened to glance in their rearview mirror and noticed the single headlight of another scooter riding a short distance behind them. At first, they did not think anything of it. It was a public road after all, and it made perfect sense that another traveler would be heading in the same direction. But after a few minutes, things began to feel very strange. Every single time the traveler slowed down to navigate a tight curve, the headlight behind them slowed down as well. When the traveler accelerated on the straightaways to put some distance between them, the other scooter immediately speeded up to match their exact pace. The traveler decided to test a theory to see if they were just being paranoid. They pulled over to the very edge of the dirt shoulder, stopped their scooter completely, and pulled out their phone as if they were checking a map. The other scooter rode past them, and for a brief second, the traveler felt a massive wave of relief wash over them. But that relief instantly vanished. About 50 yards down the dark road, the other scooter suddenly pulled off to the side of the road and stopped. The rider did not get off. They did not check their phone. They just sat there on their idling vehicle in the dark, waiting. The travelers stayed frozen where they were for about 30 seconds, watching the red glow of the waiting scooter's taillight. Deciding not to take any chances, they quickly spun their scooter around and headed back in the opposite direction. They rode as fast as they could until they spotted a brightly lit gas station where several local people were standing outside, chatting. The traveler parked, stood near the crowd, and waited for about 15 minutes to let the stranger move on. Eventually, they started to feel a bit silly, and decided they were probably just overreacting. They got back on the scooter and made the ride back to the hotel without seeing the stranger again. They went to sleep, thinking the whole thing was just a stupid misunderstanding. The next morning, the traveler spent the day relaxing on the beach. Around noon, they noticed a man sitting completely alone near the edge of the trees bordering the sand. This man was not swimming, he was not looking at the ocean, and he was not on his phone. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, watching the people on the beach. The traveler only paid attention to him because something about him felt incredibly familiar. After staring for a moment, the realization hit them. The man was wearing the exact same dark, heavy jacket as the scooter rider from the night before. Even though it was a hot day on a tropical beach, this man was sitting in a heavy jacket, staring. The traveler could not be absolutely certain because they had never seen the rider's face clearly in the dark, but a terrible feeling settled in their stomach. They decided to pack up their towel and leave the beach. As they walked back along the sandy path toward their hotel room, they glanced back over their shoulder. The man in the dark jacket was walking behind them. He was not running or walking aggressively, but he kept a steady distance, pretending to just look around. The traveler hurried to their room, locked the heavy wooden door, and stayed inside for the rest of the afternoon. By the time evening arrived, the isolation of the room was making them anxious. They decided to walk over to the front desk and mention the strange behavior to the young man working there. The clerk listened politely, but he shrugged his shoulders and smiled. He told the traveler that tourists often get very nervous when they travel alone in a foreign country, and that there was probably nothing to worry about. He told them to just call the front desk if anything weird happened. Hearing the story out loud actually made the traveler feel incredibly embarrassed. It sounded so far-fetched. A guy on a scooter was on the same road, and then a guy in a jacket was on the beach. It felt like paranoia. They went back to their room, locked the door, and went to bed, feeling stupid. But around 2 in the morning, the traveler woke up needing to use the bathroom. The room was completely dark, except for a faint sliver of moonlight shining through the gap in the curtains. As they sat up in bed, they froze. There was a faint sound coming from directly outside their window. At first, they tried to convince themselves it was just a wild animal moving through the thick jungle. But then they heard it again. It was the distinct sound of heavy footsteps on the gravel path. Because their room was on the ground floor, the footsteps were incredibly close. The sound stopped directly outside their window. The traveler sat completely still in the dark, barely breathing. About 10 seconds of agonizing silence passed. Then they heard the metal door handle of their room gently turn. It was a very slow, deliberate turn, as if someone was trying to see if the door was unlocked without making any noise. The traveler's heart started hammering against their ribs. The handle clicked back into its normal position, followed by another short pause. Then the handle was turned again, this time much harder. In a panic, the traveler grabbed their phone and dialed the number for the front desk. It rang and rang, but nobody answered. It was only then that they remembered a terrifying detail. The front office closed overnight, and there was absolutely no overnight staff on the property. They were completely alone in a building surrounded by jungle. The footsteps slowly moved away from the door and toward the window. The traveler, desperate to know what was happening, crept out of bed. They walked over to the window and peeled back a tiny corner of the curtain. There, crouched directly underneath the windowsill, was a man. He was crouched low, his head tilted back, looking straight up at the window. The very second the traveler moved the curtain, the man's eyes locked onto theirs. The stranger immediately stood up and bolted into the dark jungle. Terrified, the traveler ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with their back against it, until the sun finally came up. At 7 in the morning, the hotel owner arrived at the front office. The traveler went straight to him and explained every single detail of what had happened over the last 36 hours. For the first time, someone actually took them seriously. The owner's face went completely pale. He asked for a detailed description of the man's jacket and physical appearance. As soon as the traveler finished describing him, the owner reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and showed them a photograph. It was the exact same man. The owner explained that this man was not a guest at the hotel. In fact, he was a known local stalker who had been reported by several different businesses over the past year. He had a terrifying pattern of picking out solo tourists and following them for days at a time. Nobody knew exactly what his intentions were, because every single time the police were called, he would vanish into the jungle before they arrived. The traveler did not wait around. They packed their bags and checked out immediately. The hotel owner was very helpful and arranged a private car to take them to a much larger hotel closer to the main town. The traveler thought the nightmare was finally over. But about 2 hours into the drive, the driver pulled over at a small convenience store so the traveler could grab some water. While they were standing at the register paying, they happened to look out the front glass window. Across the street, parked beneath a large tree, was a scooter. Sitting on the scooter was a man in a dark jacket, staring directly inside the store at them. The moment the man realized the traveler had spotted him, he started his engine, turned around, and sped away into traffic. The traveler never saw him again, but the absolute terror of realizing how easily he had tracked them across miles of unfamiliar territory is something they will never forget. Our second story takes us to the historic city of Brussels, Belgium. The year was some time ago, and the narrator of this story was only 17 years old. Their school in Denmark had organized a 5-day educational trip to Brussels. Since they were traveling with a large group of close friends, they were incredibly excited to explore a new city and have some fun. Because it was a school-sanctioned trip, almost all of their daytime activities were strictly planned and mandatory. They visited museums, historic sites, and took part in group dinners. While most of the students were perfectly happy to follow the schedule, the narrator had always been a bit of a rebel. They loved the thrill of doing things they were not supposed to do, especially late at night when the teachers were asleep. The first 3 days of the trip went by in a blur of fun and laughter. By the end of the 4th day, the entire group was exhausted. The teachers announced that everyone had to go to bed early because their bus ride back to Denmark was scheduled for 5 in the morning, and it was going to be a very long, tiring drive. The students all went to their rooms to get some sleep, but the narrator was a night owl. The thought of going to sleep early and missing out on their last night in Brussels felt incredibly boring. They tried to convince their roommates to sneak out with them, but everyone was too tired and refused. The narrator was sharing a room with 3 other boys in an old, multi-story building that had been rented out specifically for their school group, though there were also a few strangers staying in other sections. Sitting outside on the hallway stairs, the narrator opened up Tinder on their phone and started messaging some local matches. To their surprise, they actually ended up setting up a late-night hookup with a girl who lived a few kilometers away. The 17-year-old took the room key, crept past the teachers' rooms, and slipped out into the cold night air. The adrenaline was pumping through their veins, and they felt a massive rush of excitement from breaking the rules. They opened Google Maps on their phone and began walking toward the coordinates the girl had sent. As they walked deeper into the city, the nice touristy areas began to fade away. The streets became incredibly quiet, dark, and run down. Soon, the narrator found themselves walking through a very poor, sketchy neighborhood. The streets were lined with large windows illuminated by bright, harsh neon lights. Behind the glass, adult workers were posing, tapping their long acrylic nails against the windows and wearing wild outfits. There were very few pedestrians around, and the ones who were out seemed to be minding their own business. For a 17-year-old kid alone in a foreign city, these streets were incredibly intimidating, but they were also too intrigued to turn back. They finally arrived at the girl's apartment building. The meeting went perfectly well, and there was absolutely nothing suspicious about the girl or the encounter. They hung out for a while, but eventually, the narrator realized they needed to get back to the hotel before the 5 in the morning wake-up call. They said goodbye and stepped back out onto the cold streets. It was September, and a freezing rain had started to fall. The narrator was only wearing a light jacket, and they quickly became shivering and miserable. They pulled out their phone and set the GPS to guide them back to the hotel. But instead of taking the familiar path they had walked earlier, the GPS selected a completely different, shorter route through an area they had never seen before. The streets were pitch black and covered in trash. The only people out in the pouring rain were groups of men standing around in dark, narrow alleyways. There were no open bars, no bright signs, and no familiar landmarks. The narrator started to feel a deep sense of unease. Just as they were trying to zoom in on the map to find a main road, their phone screen suddenly went black. The battery had completely died. The narrator completely lost their temper. The stress of being lost, freezing cold, and alone in a dangerous neighborhood boiled over. They did not care who heard them. They started shouting curse words into the empty street and slamming the phone against their palm, desperately trying to force it to turn back on. But it remained completely dead. Realizing they had to find a solution quickly, they saw an older man walking down the sidewalk toward them. The narrator swallowed their pride and walked straight up to him. The man could clearly tell that the teenager was desperate, cold, and very young. Luckily, the man was incredibly kind. The narrator explained that they were a student, that their phone had died, and that they were lost and trying to find their hotel in the city center. The man, who looked to be about the same age as the narrator's father, smiled and told them not to worry. Instead of just pointing them in the right direction, the man offered to walk with them all the way back to the hotel, even though the heavy rain was soaking them both. Despite his kindness, the narrator remained cautious. They kept one hand firmly inside their jacket pocket, gripping their keys and dead phone the entire time, making sure the stranger did not try to pickpocket them. When they finally reached the familiar entrance of the hotel building, the narrator thanked the man profusely, feeling a massive sense of relief. The hotel building had a modern automatic locking system on the main doors. The narrator swiped their key card, heard the heavy lock click shut behind them, and felt completely safe. They believed there was absolutely no way anyone could get inside without a registered key. They ran up to their room, took a quick, hot shower to wash off the freezing rain, and crawled into their bottom bunk bed. Within minutes, they fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, but just a few hours later, The narrator woke up with a strange sensation. They opened their eyes and were immediately blinded by a bright flashlight beam pointed directly at their face. They squinted, trying to block the light with their hand. As their eyes adjusted, they realized a complete stranger was leaning over the edge of the bunk, his face only inches away from theirs. The shock was so intense that the narrator could not even make a sound. Their body went completely rigid with fear. They sat up as fast as they could, pressing their back against the wall of the bunk. In a shaking voice, they asked the man in English who he was and what he was doing there. Because their 3 roommates were still fast asleep in the room, and the intruder did not seem to be holding a weapon, the narrator tried to stay calm. The stranger backed away from the bed slightly and explained in a quiet voice that he worked in the lobby. He claimed he was helping a student named Samuel search for a lost item. The narrator reached for their watch on the bedside table. The time was exactly 4 in the morning. They did have a classmate named Samuel on the trip, and Samuel was known for being incredibly messy and impulsive. It seemed plausible that Samuel might have lost something important, even at this hour. The stranger walked over to the closet and started rummaging through the students' bags. The narrator asked him why he was searching their specific room, since Samuel did not sleep in this room and had no reason to have his stuff in there. The narrator grabbed their dead phone, which had regained a tiny bit of battery, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the intruder. The man kept his back turned and muttered that Samuel had lost his visa and could not leave the country without it. Just then, another student from a neighboring room walked in and started talking to the intruder, helping him look through the closet. The narrator was so incredibly sleep-deprived and confused that they just assumed everything was fine, even though the situation was incredibly bizarre. They watched the man scan through the backpacks for a few more minutes before their eyes grew heavy, and they drifted back to sleep when the entire school group woke up at 5 in the morning to load the bus. The horrifying truth finally came to light. 3 different students in the building were missing their belongings. Laptops, wallets, and official travel visas had been stolen. The man who claimed to work in the lobby was a professional thief who had slipped into the building. He had found Samuel's stolen visa in another room, read his name, and used it to create a fake story to trick the sleeping students whenever he got caught rummaging through their rooms. The only reason he had been leaning inches away from the narrator's face was because he was about to snatch the watch and phone lying right next to his head. The police arrived quickly, and the bus ride back to Denmark had to be delayed for hours so the victims could file reports. To this day, the narrator is haunted by the thought that they might have been the one who let the thief in. In their rush to get inside from the rain, they might not have let the heavy security door latch fully behind them. Or even worse, they wonder if the thief had followed them all the way from the sketchy neighborhood, waiting for the perfect moment to slip inside. Our third and final story takes us to one of the most beautiful and remote places on Earth. In the late summer of 2019, a group of friends decided to take a road trip to the far north of Norway, deep inside the Arctic Circle. Their destination was a famous scenic region called the Lofoten Islands. It is an incredibly dramatic landscape filled with massive fjords, jagged mountains, and tiny, isolated fishing villages. Because the population up there is so sparse, large towns are very few and far between. The friends flew into a small regional airport, rented a car, and began the long journey. Their vacation rental was located in a tiny fishing village that was about a 7-hour drive from the airport. After a very long day of international flights, the group was exhausted and wanted nothing more than to reach their apartment as quickly as possible. But the speed limits in Norway are notoriously strict, and the fines for speeding are incredibly high. The narrator of this story was the only registered driver for the rental car, and they found it incredibly difficult to stay focused and stick to the slow speed limits on the long, empty stretches of road. By midnight, they had finally completed the majority of the journey. They passed through the last major town in the area, and their GPS showed they only had about 40 minutes left until they arrived at their destination. The road they were driving on was mostly a narrow single lane with dense pine forests on both sides. Suddenly, the road split into a brief overtaking lane. Ahead of them was a slow-moving Volkswagen Golf, The narrator decided to take the opportunity to pass the slow car so they could maintain their speed. They completed the pass cleanly, safely, and without any aggressive driving. They merged back into the single lane and continued chatting with their friends. But a moment later, the Volkswagen Golf accelerated rapidly and rode right up onto their bumper. The driver of the Golf began repeatedly surging forward, almost hitting their rear bumper, before braking and backing off. Then, suddenly, the stranger flipped on a massive, incredibly bright floodlight mounted directly onto the roof of his car. In northern Norway, the winters are pitch black for months at a time. So many locals install heavy-duty off-road lighting to help them see. But using this light directly behind another car was incredibly dangerous and completely blinded the narrator through their rearview mirror. The group of friends immediately grew quiet and nervous. The narrator tried to remain calm and composed, keeping their speed exactly at the legal limit, hoping the driver would get bored and back off. But the Golf stayed glued to their bumper, keeping the blinding light shining directly into their cabin. The narrator looked at their friend Jesse in the passenger seat and muttered that they should see if this guy was actually going to follow them all the way to their rental. They accelerated to put some distance between the two cars, and strangely, the Golf did not speed up to chase them. It drifted back out of sight, and the friends began to breathe a sigh of relief. But the relief did not last. Soon they reached a red light at a narrow one-lane bridge that served as the only entry point into their target fishing village. As they waited for the light to turn green, the narrator watched the mirror. Sure enough, the Golf slowly rounded the corner behind them and stopped. When the light turned green, the narrator decided they could not drive straight to their vacation rental. If they parked and started unpacking their heavy suitcases, this angry stranger would know exactly where they were sleeping. Instead, the narrator began turning down random, empty side streets in the sleepy village, trying to see if the Golf was actively tracking their movements. To their absolute horror, every single turn they made was mirrored by the headlights behind them. It was now past 1 in the morning, and the village was completely dead. Suddenly, the narrator made a wrong turn and drove directly into a dead end blocked by a wooden fence. They had no choice but to spin the car around and face their pursuer. The Golf pulled up, attempting to block the exit. But because the Golf was relatively small, the narrator put the car in gear, spun the wheel, and managed to squeeze past it with only inches to spare. As they squeezed past, the narrator looked through the driver's side window. The man behind the wheel of the Golf had a cold, completely expressionless face. His eyes were wide, dead, and locked onto them as they accelerated past. There were 3 guys in the rental car, and for a moment they considered stopping, getting out, and confronting the driver. But they were in an incredibly isolated area where hunting rifles are highly common and completely legal. For all they knew, this man had a weapon sitting in his passenger seat. The passenger, Jesse, grabbed his phone and called the local police. Because they did not speak Norwegian and did not know the local emergency numbers, it took several frustrating minutes to get through to an English-speaking operator. The operator explained that there was an officer available to help them, but they would have to drive 40 minutes back to the police station in the main town they had passed earlier. The narrator slammed on the gas and began driving back toward the town. This time, the driver of the Golf did not hold back. He stayed inches from their rear bumper the entire way, his high beams blinding them as they raced along the winding coastal cliffs. As they finally began to see the faint streetlights of the town's outskirts, the Golf suddenly slowed down and dropped back. The friends felt a brief moment of hope, but that hope was instantly crushed by what happened next. 2 other cars were waiting on the shoulder of the dark road. As the Golf slowed down, one of the waiting cars pulled out directly in front of him, and the other pulled out directly behind him. The 3 vehicles formed a tight, coordinated convoy, moving together like a pack of wolves hunting prey. The narrator was terrified. They realized this was not just a case of simple road rage. This was a coordinated trap. They followed the GPS coordinates toward the police station, which was located deep inside an industrial harbor area of the town. The streets were lined with massive, dark warehouses, shipping containers, and empty alleyways. As they finally pulled into the gravel parking lot of the police station, the 3-car convoy suddenly split up, turning down different dark side alleys to hide. They clearly knew where the police station was and wanted to avoid being seen. But when the friends jumped out of their car and ran toward the station doors, their hearts sank. The entire building was pitch black and completely locked. There was absolutely nobody inside. They called the operator back in a panic, and the operator assured them that an officer was on his way on foot from a nearby patrol. For 5 agonizing minutes, the friends stood in the dark parking lot, watching the headlights of the 3 cars slowly circling the distant intersections like sharks waiting for an opening. Finally, a tall, burly male officer emerged from around the corner of a nearby warehouse. He was initially a bit dismissive, but when he saw the girls in the group crying and shaking with terror, his demeanor changed. He told them he would get his police van and escort them out of the town safely. They got back into their rental car and began following the police van, but as they drove past a dark alleyway between 2 warehouses, the Volkswagen Golf suddenly pulled out of the shadows, sped up, and drove right past them. The driver shot the narrator one final, chilling, expressionless stare. The narrator slammed on their brakes and held down the horn, desperately trying to get the officer's attention. To their immense relief, the officer immediately flipped on his blue lights and pulled his large van sideways across the road. Blocking the Golf, the officer jumped out and the narrator's friend Jesse ran over to see what was happening. The narrator followed close behind. They saw the driver of the Golf step out of his car. He was an average-looking man, but when he spoke to the officer, he had a very thick Russian or Eastern European accent. He was completely calm, and his eyes stayed locked on the narrator the entire time. After a brief conversation, the officer walked back over to the friends and delivered some incredibly frustrating news. He explained that in Norway, driving on a public road in the middle of the night is not a crime. Even though the man had followed them for over an hour and called his friends to block them, he had technically not broken any laws. There was nothing the police could charge him with. The officer had taken down his identification details, but that was all he could do. He escorted the friends to the very edge of the town limits before turning back. The friends drove back to their rental cabin in absolute silence, parking far away from their building to avoid being tracked. They spent the rest of their vacation looking over their shoulders, wondering who those men were, what they had planned for them in the dark harbor, and how easily their dream vacation could have turned into a tragedy. These 3 chill cases serve as a stark reminder of just how fragile our safety can be when we step outside our familiar comfort zones. Whether it is a quiet beach town in Thailand, a dark alleyway in Brussels, or the breathtaking fjords of Norway, danger can appear when we least expect it. The next time you pack your bags and head out on an adventure, make sure to always trust your gut, keep your eyes open, and never assume that you are truly alone in the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We have all seen someone standing on the shoulder of a dark, empty highway with their thumb pointing up toward the sky. For decades, picking up a traveler was just a normal part of life. It was a simple act of human kindness. But over the years, that simple act turned into a dangerous gamble. You never truly know who you are letting into your vehicle. You do not know what they are carrying in their pockets, or what thoughts are running through their mind. This is a lesson that a woman named Nikki learned in the early 1980s, and it is a story that she passed down to her family and friends for many years as a warning. Nikki was a young woman in her mid-20s, living in a quiet town about a 2-hour drive away from the nearest major city. She was the kind of person who always looked for the best in people. If someone was hurting or needed a hand, Nikki was always the first to step forward, and so, on a clear afternoon, as she was driving down the highway toward the city, she noticed a man walking alone on the dirt shoulder. As her car got closer, the man stopped, turned around, and stuck out his thumb. It was the universal sign of a hitchhiker. Nikki felt a sudden wave of sympathy. She did not want to leave this man stranded in the middle of nowhere, so she quickly pulled her car over to the side of the road and rolled down her window. She asked the man if he needed a lift. The man smiled politely. He seemed a little bit shy, which actually made Nikki feel much safer about the whole situation. He told her that he was trying to get into the city. Nikki gave him a warm smile, reached over, and popped open the passenger door. The man thanked her, tossed his small bag into the back seat, and buckled himself in. As they started driving, Nikki felt completely at ease. They began chatting about ordinary things. They talked about their friends, the local news, and the weather. It was just happy small talk, and the 2 hours seemed like they were going to fly by. Nikki felt like she was getting along absolutely great with her new passenger. About halfway through the journey, Nikki decided to stop at a roadside diner for dinner. She could tell the man was looking pretty hungry, and during their conversation, he had mentioned that he was incredibly strapped for cash. In fact, he told her that was the entire reason he was hitchhiking in the first place. He simply could not afford any other way to travel. When the bill came, Nikki insisted on paying for his food. The man seemed very flustered and awkward about her generosity, but she just smiled and told him not to worry about it. Eventually, he relented and they got back in the car and went on their way. As soon as they arrived in the downtown area, the man thanked her and asked to be dropped off. But before he stepped out of the vehicle, he hesitated. He turned to Nikki and asked if he could have her phone number. He said he would love to keep in touch and catch up again one day. Nikki was absolutely thrilled. She felt proud of herself for helping a new friend, so she wrote down her number and handed it to him. She watched him walk away into the city crowd, feeling a warm sense of having done a good deed. But the problem was, appearances can be incredibly deceiving. Fast forward to exactly 1 week later. Nikki was at home when her phone started ringing. She quickly picked it up and said hello. On the other end of the line was the familiar voice of the hitchhiker, but his tone was completely different now. He did not sound shy or polite anymore. Before Nikki could even say another word, the man interrupted her. He told her that she needed to listen to him very carefully. He told her that she should thank God that she was raised to be such a nice person. The man explained that when he first stepped into her car, he was not looking for a friendly ride. He told Nikki that he had fully planned on raping her and murdering her. His plan was to wait until they reached that quiet roadside diner. He was going to lure her away, take her life, steal her car, and dump her body in a deep ditch somewhere far down the road. But as they drove, Nikki had treated him with nothing but pure kindness. She had listened to his struggles, and she had even bought him dinner with a genuine smile on her face. Because of her kindness, he simply could not bring himself to do it. He told her that he realized he could never live with himself if he harmed such a gentle soul. Then, the man gave her one final piece of advice. He pleaded with her never ever to pick up another hitchhiker again. And then he hung up. Nikki sat there in complete shock, holding the silent receiver tightly against her ear as her mind raced. She immediately tried to redial the number, but it turned out to be a public payphone on a busy street corner. She never heard from that man ever again. It is truly terrifying to think how close she came to losing her life that day, and how a simple act of genuine human kindness was the absolute only thing that saved her from a terrible fate in a dark, empty ditch. That warning is something that many drivers have had to learn the hard way. Fast forward to a cold Saturday night around 1 o'clock in the morning. A young man named Nathan was driving down Route 542 in New Jersey. If you have ever been on that road, you know it is a long, isolating stretch of highway with thick woods pressing in on both sides. There are barely any houses, and at that hour of the night there was absolutely nobody else on the road. Nathan was on his way back home after spending some time in town with his friends. Because the highway was pitch black, he turned on the high-powered off-road lights on his Jeep Wrangler just to get a better view of the path ahead. As he drove through the darkness, the bright lights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder far in the distance. As the Jeep got closer, the figure raised his arm and stuck his thumb in the air. Nathan felt his heart begin to race. He knew that stopping for a stranger in the middle of the night was a terrible idea, but his instincts competed with his desire to help. He slowed down his vehicle just to get a good look at the person. It appeared to be a young man, probably around 28 years old, wearing a light gray hoodie with the hood pulled up high over his head, and blue denim jeans. In a sudden split-second decision, Nathan ignored his better judgment. He brought the Jeep to a complete stop, rolled down the window, and asked the stranger where he was heading. The man looked at him and said in a quiet tone that he was just heading up the road. Nathan told him to hop in. The man walked over slowly and opened the passenger door. Now, Jeep Wranglers are known for having very tight seals on the doors, meaning you have to close them with some force. When the man tried to pull the door shut, it did not latch properly. Nathan politely looked over and told him that the door did not shut all the way, and that he just needed to open it and slam it shut really hard. But the stranger's response to this simple request was deeply unsettling. The man did not move. He just sat there frozen for about 3 seconds. Then he slowly turned his head to look directly at Nathan. He paused again, then slowly turned his head to the right. He waited another 3 or 4 seconds in complete silence before finally opening the door and slamming it shut. The slow, robotic way the man moved made Nathan instantly regret his decision to let him into the car. But it was too late to back out now. Nathan put his foot on the gas and the Jeep began to speed down the road. The speed limit on Route 542 was 55 miles per hour, but Nathan pushed his vehicle up to 75 miles per hour. He just wanted to get this man to his destination as fast as humanly possible and get him out of his sight. Nathan tried to break the heavy silence in the vehicle. He asked the man how far up the road he needed to go. There was an incredibly awkward gap of silence before the passenger finally replied, with just a few miles up the road. Nathan wanted to reach over and turn on the radio just to drown out the suffocating silence, but a voice in the back of his mind told him to keep his hands on the wheel and stay completely focused. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Nathan noticed that the passenger had turned his head and was staring directly at him. For a full mile, Nathan could feel the man's heavy gaze burning into the side of his face. He kept his eyes locked on the road, doing everything in his power not to look back. And then the passenger finally broke his silence. In a calm voice, he asked Nathan if he had ever wondered for the longest time if it was just worth it to end it all. Nathan felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He looked over in utter confusion and terror. At that moment, the man reached his hand deep into his pocket. He told Nathan that he had been carrying a knife with him for the past few weeks, just wondering when the right time would come to use it. And then he pulled a large red folding knife out of his pocket. Nathan felt his stomach completely drop. He was trapped in a moving vehicle on a pitch-black highway with an armed, unstable stranger. He managed to keep his voice steady and calm enough to tell the man to put the knife away immediately, but the passenger did not seem bothered at all by the request. In a flat, emotionless voice, he pointed ahead and told Nathan to pull over next to the speed limit sign on the shoulder. Fearing what might happen if he refused, Nathan complied. He slowed the Jeep down and brought it to a stop right next to the metal sign. What followed next still haunts Nathan to this very day. The man did not try to attack Nathan right away. Instead, he raised the blade and began to violently slit his own forearm. Nathan watched in complete horror as the metal blade cut deep into the skin, right alongside 3 older scars from previous self-inflicted wounds. The man let out a low, disturbing groan as the blood started to drip. Nathan was completely terrified. He managed to choke out the words, telling the man that he needed to get out of his car right now. The man stopped what he was doing, turned his bloodied arm toward Nathan, and looked at him with completely empty, hollow eyes. He told Nathan to get out of the car because there was something he wanted to show him. Nathan immediately refused the offer, but the man raised the sharp knife closer to Nathan's face in a clear, silent threat. He repeated himself, telling Nathan to just get out for a second, and that there was something he wanted to show him behind that sign. At this point, Nathan knew his life was on the line. He had to act fast and be incredibly smart to survive. He forced himself to look calm. He looked at the man and said, "Yeah, okay, let's go." Nathan opened his driver's side door, making sure to leave it wide open. He stepped out onto the dark highway, raised his hands in the air, and slowly backed away from the vehicle. The passenger also opened his door and stepped out. The man started walking slowly around the front of the Jeep, heading over to Nathan's side. But the passenger made one critical mistake. As he walked around the vehicle, there was a brief moment where he was directly behind the hood, blocked from Nathan's line of sight. At that exact second, Nathan sprinted back to the open driver's seat. He jumped inside, pulled the door shut, slammed the gear shifter into drive, and floored the accelerator. The tires squealed as the Jeep launched forward down the road, leaving the armed stranger standing completely alone in the pitch-black woods. Nathan drove straight home, his chest heaving, as he tried not to throw up from the sheer adrenaline. He had survived a nightmare, and he knew he would never stop for a stranger on a dark road ever again. But sometimes the danger comes when you are the one who is stranded on the road, desperate for a ride home. Back in 2005, a 16-year-old teenager went to a massive party deep in the countryside of Virginia with his friends, Alex and Brianna. Because they planned to drink, Brianna was supposed to be their designated driver. But fast forward a few hours, and Brianna had to leave suddenly for a family emergency. Alex promised they would easily find another ride, but as the night went on, he vanished into the crowd too. Stranded and heavily intoxicated at 2 in the morning, the teenager decided to walk home along the dark, empty highway. After walking for about 15 long minutes in the cold air, a faded blue Ford Explorer pulled up next to him on the highway. The driver looked out and offered him a warm lift home. Overjoyed, the exhausted teenager climbed into the passenger seat and immediately passed out from all the alcohol. When he woke up a while later, he realized they were on a completely unfamiliar road, heading deep into the dark woods. He nervously asked where they were going and begged to be let out, but the driver turned to look at him with a cold expression and said a firm, terrifying no. Panicking and feeling incredibly sick from the alcohol, the teenager pretended to gag. As the driver slowed down in disgust, the teenager actually threw up directly onto the driver's lap. The screaming man slammed on the brakes in absolute shock, and the teenager pushed the door open, bolted into the dark woods, and hid under some thick bushes. The driver searched for him with a bright flashlight, walking right past his hiding spot. Once the driver went deeper into the forest, the teenager ran back to the road, flagged down a passing car, and made it home safely to his family. He never got the license plate, and the kidnapper was never caught by the police. But he never forgot how a desperate ride with a stranger almost cost him his life, leaving a permanent scar on his memory. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.